Good morning. This is Jason Dean coming at you live from Film Fanatic. It is Wednesday at a quarter after 11 already. It's hard to believe it's already Wednesday. These weeks just freaking fly right by. So hope everyone's doing good. Um, yeah, it's been had a couple days where I wasn't able to do some movie reviews. I have a bunch of videos that I did over I think last week. So I'm going to be uploading, so there'll be some more videos coming your way. It's been a few days. Every now and then I get a little bit jammed up with schedule stuff, and I just don't have quite enough time in the morning to do them. But so yeah, there's going to be some more videos coming your way. There's a ton of videos that I have planned and a bunch of stuff, so stay tuned for that. You know, I want to always want to thank people for checking out this wacky channel, commenting, and new people I've met, and some new folks along the way, especially who have their own YouTube channels. The coolest guy I've met is a gentleman by the name of 42nd Street Forever. He is a British YouTube guy who reviews only pretty much exploitation movies, and I think it's safe to say right now he's probably my favorite channel in existence. He just rocks, and he seems like a wicked cool guy. And so we talked about maybe doing a show together where he would come on and be a guest on Film Fanatic, because this guy is kind of next level as far as his like deep knowledge of film, and especially in the world of sleazy exploitation. So today, staying with that theme, today is about a very sleazy movie. Pretty nasty and low down film. I've seen this movie a couple times. I actually did a review of this movie, but it was a little bit of a different format. I got this really awesome combo pack a couple of years ago, and I did a review for this whole thing as a whole, and it has two movies on it. Those two movies are The Ravager and The Bushwhacker. The Bushwhacker came out in 1968, and then also The Ravager, which is today's show, came out in 1970. When I originally did a video for this package, I've gotten some really good double features on Blu-ray. They're really cheap, and I've gotten some really great exploitation movies. I'm sure these movies you can buy them separately. I would imagine. I've never come across them, but there's no special features on here. But the transfer is spectacular on Blu-ray. But when I did a show on this disc, this collection, I did it probably about a year and a half ago, or about a year ago. It was one of the first videos I did, and I did it as a whole. But I decided I really love these movies, and they're really, really great. So I wanted to do separate shows where I'm just going to do a show on the movies themselves and have their own standalone videos. So I did a show on The Bushwhacker, which has been done. I have not uploaded it yet, but it will be getting put up soon. And today's show is on The Ravager, which is this guy here on top. And my God, this movie is so nasty. It's definitely one of the nastier horror exploitation movies I've ever seen. Very disturbing. It's next level as far as the kind of the sleaze factor. There's all this really great and like super low down and dirty kind of lesbian sex in this film. It's almost like, well, again, it's a cross. Sometimes these exploitation movies really tote a fine line between full on pornography or softcore porn. I like last night I was talking with a friend on the phone, and I mentioned that I had watched this movie again, and I told her a little bit about it. And just in my general descriptions, he's like, "Are you watching a porn?" And I was like, "Well, it's not really a porn. It's not a porn. I don't consider The Ravager to be a porn. But again, it does push the envelope, and some people could regard it as being a pornography film. But I kind of feel it leans more into um, I yeah, I definitely feel it leans more into just a fictional horror movie, slasher movie. That's kind of what I think of it. It's definitely a slasher movie, and I think it kind of lends itself more to that. And it's interesting too. Now that I've talked about this film a little bit, and I at face value I described the Ravager, and it came out in 1970. And for all intents and purposes, I definitely, if I had to call, or label this film, at face value as to like what kind of style it is. Not that that really matters, but sometimes it's easy to do for describing a movie. Say, for instance, at face value, I would call this movie just a real sleazy slasher film. Super, super low budget, and kind of and then probably after or right behind that, if I was to use a title for or a specific genre title to this film, I would call it like a sex exploitation movie. But definitely a slasher movie, and it's interesting too because I've talked about slasher films a lot on this channel, and the slasher subgenre in the world of exploitation is my jam. That is my ultimate. That's my favorite style of all time. And I talked a lot about Black Christmas, which is, I think overall the most important slasher movie ever made. And it's interesting because I have said in the past, like that movie, for instance, is not. I don't believe it's the first slasher movie. I think it's probably the most influential, and it definitely, brought that style into its own. For example, that movie was a major influence on John Carpenter's Halloween. John Carpenter was good friends. The director of Halloween was really good friends with Bob Clark, the director of uh, Black Christmas. And so he's said many times in interviews that he looked at Black Christmas as being a model. And I've also said, Black Christmas, as amazing as it is, I don't. And sometimes I hear people talk about it as being the first kind of slasher movie, and I've said, well, it's. I think that's kind of a true statement to a degree, but then I also feel like it's not a true statement because I do think slasher movies have come. There have been movies before the, you know, the whole before Black Christmas and movies that were kind of doing that were kind of created in that style before the slasher boom. I think the slasher style in the world of exploitation, probably safe to say, was definitely the biggest subgenre in the world of exploitation. I think that really exploded. There was a period of time where slasher movies were one of the biggest, if not the biggest, draw in for commercial in the commercial realm, and then also in the exploitation realm. The two biggest in the commercial realm being the first Friday 13th, and then also Halloween. So and then you had the lower budget films that were even lower and a little bit dirtier. They were all huge also in their markets. So, but I think the Ravager, for example, is an example of like at face value, like it's definitely I consider it to be more of a slasher movie than anything. And again, this movie predates Black Christmas. Black Christmas came out in '73, so this came out in '70. So again, it didn't create the genre. It wasn't the first slasher genre, and so there are movies that predated Black Christmas that were kind of doing the same kind of thing. And I also feel there's a lot of giallo films that also had the slasher element that was very much a part of the that whole world that eventually had taken the idea of the kind of the gloved killer or the serial killer, where and then the concept of where you have a cast of young actors or actresses that get picked off one by one. That's that was happening in a lot of earlier giallo films. Sergio Martino is one director I can think of that definitely did a lot of that kind of thing. Like one movie, Torso, is a giallo film, but I kind of look at that also as being kind of a slasher movie. But so it's interesting. That's again my favorite thing to do is tracing kind of the lineage. When a lot of these things came about, or when they were brought to the surface, or they were starting to incorporate these elements. And again, I think Black Christmas was a pivotal movie in the genre because it really took those influences and kind of formalized them and put them created this like kind of standard recipe on how to make a slasher movie, where it really ushered in this new era. One other movie that I've talked about before that I think is really, really important to the world of slasher movies is Blood Feast. And again, this is an example of a movie that predated everything. If you're talking specifically about the genre of slasher movies, Blood Feast might be the earliest form of what would be or what would become the slasher genre. Blood Feast came out in 1963, which is wild. So that predated, say, Black Christmas by a whole bunch of time, by many years. And that was, of course, directed by the great and legendary Herschel Gordon Lewis. I love that movie to death. It's one of my favorite movies. It's my favorite Herschel Gordon Lewis movie. It was the first movie I ever saw Herschel Gordon Lewis was 2000 Maniacs, but it's his masterpiece. So it's again, this goes back even further, but The Ravager is definitely one of the nastiest movies. It's pretty bad. It's pretty rough. Like there's a lot of torture scenes in this scene in this movie. It's not like it's so low budget, so there's like practical effects, and it's really shoddy and it's really kind of terribly made in a lot of ways. But it's still, I don't know. This movie still, when you watch The Ravager, it still makes for a pretty jarring experience. It's not a very well. There's a lot of sex in this movie. There's mostly a lot of lesbian sex, but there's no like penetration per se. But there's a lot of lesbian sex, so it kind of has a pornography element to it. Obviously, it kind of totes that line between hardcore porn and softcore porn. Porn is definitely a big aspect of this movie. A lot of the times too, you come across, like in my discoveries, a lot of these exploitation directors made that transition from the 60s and 70s, coming out of making what they called back then, before they used the word porn, they would call them more or less like nudie films, and they were essentially porn films, where they came out of that world and then moved into, say, making horror films. And so there's a lot of that spillover, if you will, in with a lot of these directors in the exploitation world, of where they initially started in the pornography world and then transitioned into doing more, character-based movies, if you want to call it that, or horror-based movies. So there's like, you have that. So I think that's one of the reasons why so many of these exploitation movies are so, spicy, because of that. And then the sex exploitation genre is a genre I really love in the exploitation world itself, and it's actually a huge genre onto itself. And I think that's why so many of these movies have that element to them. So it's an interesting, I don't know, real interesting period in history of that period of cinema in those decades. The '60s, because we're talking '60s, mid to late '60s, '70s, '80s, and the height of the when the explosion happened of exploitation and especially slasher. The slasher genre was like in the late '70s in the early '80s to the mid late to early to the mid '80s, period. That decade, that was when it really hit the surface, and it was huge. And you also had that period of where so many directors that were trying to become filmmakers, they saw that commercially the big thing that was going was to make a horror movie. So a lot of directors, even directors that went on to do many different styles, or they never returned to that style, meaning horror, a lot of them started their careers by making horror films because it was huge. You had, at one point, the horror genre was the biggest, genre in the world of cinema, really. When you take a genre, it really, really was. And it was massively successful in that period, in those decades. And then, towards the late '80s into the '90s, it kind of died off. You still had franchises that really propelled Friday 13th franchise, obviously, the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise, the Nightmare on Elm Street franchise, the Halloween franchise. They propelled the genre of, like the slasher genre, if you will, into these new commercial heights. And you still had exploitation movies that were made, but that kind of ended. The world of exploitation kind of ended in the late '80s. You know, going into the '90s, things really changed and shifted a lot. Well, 42nd Street changed. A lot of those theaters closed. So things were changing. And once VHS came, things did shift significantly. And to where you still have movies that are being made in that genre or are still a huge influence, but as a whole, it kind of just went away. And at that time, like in the '80s, '90s, or in the mid '90s, horror kind of died a slow death, and suddenly horror wasn't making any money. And it really wasn't until Wes Craven directed Scream, which was a phenomenon in the box office, that kind of relaunched the whole horror genre as we know it. And now it's, for all intents and purposes, it's still massively popular, if not more popular than ever. So it's an interesting trajectory that horror, commercial horror films, but then you have the exploitation subgenre and the slasher genre, and the trajectory of that, and how at one point, it has these, crazy ebb and flows, and, where the landscape changes, drastically. But I think a movie like The Ravager was definitely, a movie that came out in a real interesting period in history as far as exploitation. It was definitely when things were kind of getting revved up, and people were really, there were lots of directors, there were a lot of filmmakers that were just going for it. This whole kind of guerrilla style of filmmaking was really moving forward and becoming this thing. And so this was an example of that. But I highly recommend The Ravager. It's brutal. It's pretty rough to watch. Not for the faint at heart, but it's so bad at times that it's kind of laughable. Even though I don't think they intended to make it a comedy. And it is very much it very much is a sex exploitation movie too. So it does kind of lighten the disturbing nature of the film, because it is very disturbing. But I love it. I think it's an awesome movie. That's why I decided to do this, kind of one-off show where I'm just going to be talking about The Ravager. So I highly, highly recommend it. It's a great movie. I think does exist. I would imagine it does exist somewhere where you can buy it, separately or what have you. It's great. It's just a fabulous movie. It came out in 1970. It was directed by Charles Nizet, and I don't know much about this movie. There's not a lot of information about this movie, but it's great. It's one of the definitely one of the most low down and dirty exploitation movies I have in my collection. One of the most low budget. Probably one of the most obscure movies, but it's it's kind of one of my favorites, and I've only seen it a couple times, and it's been every time I've seen it, just the other night when I watched it again, I enjoyed it even more. So, thanks again, and we will see you next time. Peace.